Hi, I'm Dr. Paul Louis Metzger, and I'm the director of New Wine, New Wineskins. Welcome to New Wine Tastings, where every week we'll have an opportunity to engage people from diverse backgrounds, all in the attempt to build relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture. We are desirous of the opportunity to engage in deep and meaningful ways, and we're really thrilled and excited to have you with us. Hi, I'm Paul Louis Metzger. I'm the director of New Wine, New Wineskins, and I'm here with my colleague, Tony Wynn, who's a pastor in the area. And Tony, thanks for joining me once again for New Wine Tasting.
Absolutely.
Today we're going to be talking about patriotism. We're going to be talking about militarism. We're going to be talking about the theme of partisan pietism, and we'll unpack what that means. And all in the context of honoring the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Month of January is a time when we remember Dr. King and we reflect on him, Americans and people beyond America from all walks of life. And so while we only have one perspective, it is our perspective to share about the legacy of this great public theologian and prophetic voice in our culture, both then, in the 60s, 50s and 60s,
Absolutely.
And also now.
Absolutely.
So again, I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Likewise.
And if we could start out, Tony, just by talking about patriotism. That's the
Yep.
first thing. Then we'll talk about militarism and then partisan pietism, and we'll unpack that. To talk about patriotism, you and I were talking a lot about this in the context of the recent killing, call it assassination, whatever you want to call it, of the Iranian general and all the global regional reaction to that, even reaction in our own government.
Yeah.
What's involved with that, and we'll come to speak about that. But I asked you, how are youth in your own circle at church reflecting on this matter of the shooting, the killing of this Iranian general, the response from the Iranians, and all that's going on? How are they responding? And feel free to share.
Absolutely. I think when it comes to the youth of the communities that I'm a part of, they're not necessarily silent on these issues, nor are they apathetic. But I think for our youth today, they face a barrage of important issues of various magnitudes and severity. And for our youth, they carry a weight that is different than generations past. I think for our youth today, in terms of what they're concerned about, things like school shootings and climate change and the LGBTQ community and the rights for that community comes up to the forefront of their mind, and how their convictions are shaped and formed. And so in regards to patriotism and this situation we find ourselves in as a nation in regards to Iran, it's not that the youth are silent, but I think far often our youth are told to be silent, whether by their peers or by people of a different generation. I think often our youth are told that because of their youthfulness or their age, they don't have wisdom to offer. They don't have a critique or perspective to offer into this particular situation. And so in regards to what has transpired at the beginning of this new year in regards to Iran, I would say it's not that the youth of my communities are apathetic or indifferent. It's that they live in this liminal space and this tension of being told to be silent because they're not the ones making any decisions, and also having to already address a magnitude and a plethora, a spectrum of other concerns and issues that are at the forefront of their minds and their hearts.
So here you are, a little bit older than they, right? And you're trying to, in a sense, as a youth pastor, be a bridge between that generation, the youth in your church, and other generations in your own church. How do you go about doing that, in a sense, being a bit of a bridge and affirming them, wanting to hear their voice, not wanting them to be silenced, but in dialogue with other generations? I know that wasn't part of our script, but I'm just fascinated.
No, absolutely. I think it's addressing the concerns that they bring up. And right now the concerns, and I think this would be of great comfort to people of an older generation. The concerns I hear a lot from our young people in the churches: how do I have a healthy and robust, sustainable relationship with the Lord? How do I grow in my affections? And sometimes it may not be in those words or as explicit, but that's the center of our conversation and what our conversations revolve around. So
that's a great centering point
right.
for that.
And so as much as people will say, man, the church is dying in America or faith is going away, no, our young people are very much religious. They're very much faithful people. They're concerned about issues of the faith. And so wherever the pendulum swings regarding conversations, our young people are concerned about issues of the faith and how do they grow in their affections for the Lord. And so those are the issues I'm addressing. But when it comes to politics, gender, sexuality, race, I think for our young people, I would do them a disservice if I can't give them an honest answer. But because of the division and the partisanship we find in our communities, in our homes, our families, and in our churches, oftentimes an honest answer causes much division. And it isn't my heart to send our people out to cause division. And so knowing where they're at in their formation, in their development, in their maturity, it's not that I want to withhold information from them or degrade them or say that they're not ready, but my heart for them first is to fall in love with the Savior. And then the implications for their love for the Savior follows. And so right now the conversations are really, man, how do I help you walk closer and nearer to the Lord? And then from there, as I earn their trust, earn a hearing, once questions regarding race, politics, sexuality, the whole gambit come, it's dialogical and it's not lecturing and it's not sermonic. Not to say that a lecture or a sermon isn't appropriate, but I think coming back to our previous conversations regarding ministry and mission and the incarnation, when it comes to ministering to people of all ages, but in my specific context with youth, I have to earn the right to gain a hearing. And just because I'm older doesn't mean I have any more say or more perspective, but it means that, man, this dialogical experience has to take place, and it requires me to earn their trust, and it requires me to answer the questions they're asking me now. And so I mean that's what I would say is it begins first with answering their questions right now, and their questions are, how do I have a relationship with Jesus, with God?
Right. Thank you, Tony. And again, we're going to be trying to weave in all of these points in relationship to Dr. King, and especially his message that he gave April 4th, 1967, a year to the day of his assassination, namely his critique of the Vietnam War.
Absolutely.
And so one of the things that King talked about there is that in any kind of conflict, we have to earn trust.
Yeah.
We have to gain trust. We need to get to know our enemy, and there's a sense in which we need to put ourselves in their shoes, and we have to go forward and take the risk to understand, to listen. That's what I'm going to call earning trust, gaining
Absolutely.
trust, because a lot of the partisanship that we have, and we'll talk more about it, is we don't have trust. We're just lobbing grenades, and that can happen generationally in churches.
Right.
And you said that sometimes they just feel silenced, and you're trying to listen to them, inquire, be dialogical, not just telling them what to believe, but to draw them out. I think that's in keeping with the spirit of Dr. King, as we're thinking about it. As someone who comes from a Vietnamese context, you talked about how youth can often feel isolated, marginalized.
Yeah.
Talk about another group that's often felt marginalized in our country, refugee community at first, coming from Vietnam. What's that like in your context when you've been in Vietnamese churches as it relates to patriotism?
Right. I would say, so for myself personally, when I engage Dr. King and his body of work in regards to the topic of patriotism, for me it started as a kid early on, where I had this color book that was about 10 pages, and it was a color book of Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech.
Wow.
And I would read that book and tear it to shreds. And my mom always asked me what my fascination was with Dr. King. All it was I enjoyed the pictures and the colors and seeing the cartoons of kids of different colors. I think reflecting back on it now where I am in life and my engagement with Dr. King, when I think of patriotism, I think of his I Have a Dream speech. When we talk about a patriot, somebody who wants the best for their country, I can think of no better expression.
I have a dream for this country. I have
Exactly.
a dream for this world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For all people who call this nation and this land home, Dr. King's dream was a dream of a patriot. And so in reflection of that, as a person, as an individual, I see Dr. King's patriotism. And then I think as somebody who is Vietnamese, as a second generation Vietnamese American, as a child of a refugee, I think that history and those points of intersectionality makes any response and assessment complex. And all of life is complex. But for the Vietnamese people, all Vietnamese people, whether it be northern or southern, have experienced a sense of great loss. A sense of having a homeland and a place robbed and taken from them. And I think for southern Vietnamese people who are now in America, who fled their war-torn country, that sense of loss...
That would have been true of your parents?
Absolutely, yeah. My mom and my dad, yeah. For them, it never goes away, that sense of profound loss. And the fear of losing once again is so prevalent. It never goes away. And so, in engagement and interaction with that community of refugees and their profound sense of loss and the fear of losing once again, their patriotism makes sense. That for them as patriots, they don't want America, the United States, their new home, to be taken away from them again. So they have this profound sense of wanting to defend this country. They have a profound sense of debt to this country. And so that's the space I sit in as a second generation.
Which is very different, I would assume, than at times the space you sit in other church contexts than when you're in a Vietnamese church context,
Absolutely.
right? More of the Anglo church context. I mean, there might be a profound sense of affirmation and regard and gratitude for this country, but it's somewhat different, isn't it? Because of the story of the history.
Right. And what I find so complex about all of this is I absolutely identify with Dr. King's speech in regards to being against the Vietnam War. As a child of a refugee of the Vietnam War, and for my parents' generation, they're so grateful and thankful to the United States for intervening.
For waging
Absolutely.
in the war? Yeah.
Absolutely.
So you feel this tension right
absolutely, sitting and so at times when it's worse and at times of great division difficulty, the generational conflict would say, "Man, Tony, you're so young, so privileged, and so soft because you don't know what it's like to grow up in wartime." And so for you to identify with Dr. King's speech, you are doing away with our story and our journey as refugees. And I never want to dishonor my mom's generation, my mom's experience, because I wouldn't be here without them. On the other side, though, to see Dr. King's love for country, but also profound love for the Lord, and that take place through his speech, that's the tension I find myself in. Yeah.
And so when we think about the speech, Why I'm Against the Vietnam War, Beyond Vietnam, that he gave ultimately, I believe, in Riverside Church, New York City, 1967, April 4th, 1967. Probably the most radical speech. Famous author, you're aware of him, Vietnamese author, did an article on that speech I think in January of 2018, 2019, I can't remember when, in Time Magazine about that's the real speech that we have to account for today.
Yeah.
The author's name, do you recall?
Is it
very famous literature?
Viet Thanh Nguyen.
I think it was.
Yep.
I think it
Professor in California.
Yeah, and powerful article.
Absolutely.
Powerful article. But that's a potent speech where he talks about militarism, economic exploitation, and racism, and we'll get into a bit of that today, especially with militarism. But King was a person in tension. He loved his country. He saw himself as a patriot. He didn't see himself as a nationalist, and we'll come to that. But he saw himself as a patriot, and he does in the midst of the speech talk about how people think he's not patriotic because he's not getting on board. He lost a lot of support in '67. The last few years of his life are years of intense digression in terms of his fan base. The Nobel Prize was way in the rear view window, so to speak, way back.
Absolutely.
And last 3 years of life, the HBO movie King in the Wilderness is well worth everyone watching. I've watched it. It's so powerful. King in the Wilderness, HBO. The last 3 years of his life, just really, really taking a downturn in terms of public support. And that didn't get help with his critique of the Vietnam War.
Absolutely.
In fact, some of his supporters said, "What are you doing? You're taking away the focus on civil rights here." He said, "If I don't speak to this issue of the Vietnam War, I'm really not standing true to in terms of my prophetic role." So he said, "I have to." It's consistent.
Absolutely.
Because if my own people can't have the right to sit down with a Caucasian or a white person in a counter in a cafe in this country, and the only time that they can actually be in the same setting with someone is in a foxhole in Vietnam, something's wrong with that.
Absolutely.
And he says in that same message, when the press in this country praise me for saying be nonviolent toward the white supremacists who were attacking with dogs and with fire hoses and beatings and guns and such, be nonviolent, and they praise me for that, and yet they take major issue when I say be nonviolent toward little Vietnamese children in Vietnam. He says there's something deeply wrong with that press in the speech. The King said, wherever there's not a deep sorrow, there's not a deep love, or wherever there's not a deep love, there's not a deep sorrow. And so he says, I have this sorrow because I love my country. The prophets like Jeremiah loved Jerusalem. They loved Judah. They loved Israel. They spoke prophetically, challenging, but ultimately because they longed for a greater dream, the beloved community in the case of King, where all people who were once enemies would be brought together through equity and justice and love. So, King was accused of not being patriotic. And here closer to home today, in light of the assassination, we have senators, congresspeople, even accusing one another of not being patriotic. I mean, I'm thinking of what at least Rand Paul said, senator from, Kentucky?
I think so, yeah.
Sharing real concern about what Senator Lindsey Graham said about him and his views, and I think Senator Lee from Utah perhaps, that they're not being patriotic because they want a full accounting of the assassination. We're not here to talk about the assassination of the Iranian general today, but they were calling for transparency, and they weren't getting it, they thought. Graham says they have obvious info before them, and also said toward the Democrats, but he also said toward his own colleagues in the GOP, this is going to play right into the hands of our enemies when you're asking these kinds of questions and challenging. And Rand Paul says, hardly, this is what the Constitution's about. I'm being patriotic. I'm holding to the ideals of the Constitution. And same thing with Senator Lee. Again, we're not out to debate these men who's patriotic or not, but this debate's alive and well in the Senate. So whether we're thinking about the Vietnamese refugees, your youth group at the church you're pastoring now, or the senators and both Democrat and Republican as relates to this recent killing or assassination, and then also King, patriotism. And we'll come to the distinction between patriotism and nationalism later. I think everyone should be patriotic, but that doesn't mean, for our nation or whatever our nation is, but that doesn't mean everything our nation does is just okay, or everything our church does.
Absolutely.
If we're thinking about loyal to a church, that it's okay. We need to be transparent. We need to be open. We need to be people of integrity. And so that's what King was about. And he shows that concern
Absolutely.
and addressing that concern that people had of him in the I have real concerns or beyond Vietnam speech.
Absolutely. And Paul, in a recent article you wrote on Pathos, you had talked about how Joshua, in his conquest of Canaan, comes face to face with the general of the Lord's army, and he asks the Lord's general, "Whose side are you on?"
Right.
And the general says, "I'm on God's side." And so that sits perfectly for us in regards to patriotism, militarism, and what we're calling partisan pietism.
Yeah, partisan pietism.
And so frame that for us. If God's general says he's neither on the Canaanite side or Joshua's side, but he's on God's side, and the Israelites are God's people, what are the implications for that for patriotism? What are the implications for militarism? Could you unpack that?
Again, if we think of Dr. King, when he talks about critiquing the Vietnam War, and again, he's not out to critique soldiers. He's not out to critique people who are laying down their lives. He's talking about the structures, what he takes to be structures of evil with racism, economic exploitation, and militarism. And we'll, again, talk about militarism. That's what he's after. He's not out to attack the soldiers. King doesn't go out looking to attack people. You know, he saw people not as things, but as persons, and having inalienable rights and indescribable dignity that could never be contained under a construct. But when we think of King in that message talking about, ultimately, I'm on God's side, the captain of the Lord's army says to Joshua, I'm not on your side or those of Jericho's side and the Canaanite side. I am the captain of the Lord's army. I speak for God. And as the captain of the Lord's army, Joshua 5, take off your sandals. This is holy ground. Right. And so, Joshua has to come clean before God. We have to come clean before God. And for King, for him, the moral arc of the universe is long, he says in that sermon on the Vietnam War, but it bends toward justice. Mm-hmm. King believed that rights and truth and justice were inherent to the universe. Right. Some say he was a big advocate of virtue ethics, about the person being ethical, virtuous. Others say he was into natural law, divine decree, whatever you want to call it. But when we think about natural law, it's inherent. And a lot of people today think, no, ethics, morality, that's all subjective. It's human creation. That wasn't King's view. It was inherent. So for him, when he's speaking out about the Vietnam War, it's like, I'm not speaking out ultimately to affirm America or the Vietnamese and to take sides on this issue. He says, ultimately, I speak as someone seeking to be a prophet of the Lord. A prophetic voice, knowing that he himself is not perfect, but truth and ethics and justice is beyond any one nation. And so we have to say, ultimately, for ourselves, I'm not for this country, or God is not on our side. The question is, are we on God's side in any particular conflict? And that's for America, that's for Iran, that's for Vietnam, that's for England. I could just go through the list.
Absolutely.
Whose side are we on? And that was what Joshua was being asked, ultimately by the captain of the Lord's army. Whose side are you on, Joshua? And who are we on the side of? And God is for the orphan, the widow, and alien in their distress. Are we for them? And that's something the King was after in that speech when he deals not only with militarism, but economic exploitation of the poor and racism, that those structures were well entrenched in our society, weren't going away, especially with all the money we were pouring into the war. It was going to take away, with the building of that industrial military complex, from concerns for the most marginalized in our society.
And so for Christ followers, that has profound implications for our patriotism. Mm-hmm. If the reframing of the question takes place as this, it's not whether or not God is on our side or their side, but the question is, are we on God's side? Could you unpack the implications for patriotism. What does it mean then when we ask, as Christ followers, what does it mean for us to ask, how are we to be patriots?
Yeah. Well, maybe we could come back to that later when we deal with this idea of partisan pietism.
Yeah, absolutely.
And maybe get in a little bit more to militarism at this point, because I'd like to tie that in toward the end, if that's okay.
Please.
Yeah, so with militarism, we're talking about January here. It's January, the month we honor King with his birthday. It was also in January of 1961 that President Eisenhower, a five-star general, war hero before he became president, conquering general, so to speak, for America and the Allies during World War II. He becomes a president, a successful two-term president, and he's leaving office just around the time that President Kennedy will take office. President Eisenhower delivers his closing address to America, and it's a very haunting address, and I encourage people to go and watch it. Haunting, you would normally expect a president, to talk about all the great successes of their presidency and say, here's what we accomplished. Instead, what he focuses on primarily is his concern about what he calls the industrial military complex. Now remember, he's a war hero. He's a leading general, was the leading general of the Allied forces, at least in Europe, MacArthur in Japan and Asia, but Eisenhower's a great general and two-term president. The Korean conflict had taken place during his watch and so on and so forth. But here he is showing ultimate concern about a standing army. He says, we've never had a standing army like this in America's history. We tend to bring down the army when we're not in conflict, but he had a standing army, and he says, we can't get out of that because we're in the Cold War era, we're having these conflicts all around us, so we can't avoid, in his estimation, having the standing army, a very large standing army. But he was concerned, and he didn't put it in the message, but I think he was concerned about certain members of Congress even representing districts where military complexes, industrial complexes, big business with military were present, and they were advocating. There were lobbyists pushing for more and more because it was very financially lucrative. And Eisenhower's concerned about this. He is someone who's a patriot. You can't take away from that. He is someone who is very concerned for America's stability and the world's stability, and he believes the military is key.
Lest anybody accuse him of being anti-military.
Yeah, exactly. but some did. Some did, because he was very reticent on the increase of budgets for military, because he was thinking, where will the checks come from? We need checks on this, because the more it's big business, and I think that was part of his concern, the more people will seek to build these. Not just because of Russia, not just because of our concerns out there, but it builds the economy, or certain aspects of the economy, and very lucratively speaking.
Because war is lucrative.
Yeah, it often is. And so here's a war hero, successful two-term president, leaving office. And he makes that the focus of his message. It's a haunting message. It's a powerful message. I think it's one of the most important messages we've had by a president who's leaving office. King picks up on that, as do others, in that Vietnam War speech several years later. 6 years later, 1967, 1961, 1967. King talks about, militarism, economic exploitation, and racism. And for him, they're all connected. It's striking to me, President George W. Bush, when he talked about an axis of evil, what did he talk about? He talked about Iran, Iraq, North Korea. Dr. King's axis of evil was racism, militarism, and economic exploitation. And he saw all those three connected. Absolutely. Economic exploitation, because the more we pour into building military stockpiles and such, beyond, for Eisenhower, I think, what would ultimately be necessary, and certainly for King, more than was far necessary, and he was a pacifist, a principled pacifist. The more we pour there into that, the less we're putting our energies into caring for the poor. He talks about that in that message. And then also racism, because who are the ones who often go to war most? If not poor, people, are the poor. And often the only place where someone who's African American might get a chance to get a leg up might be through the military,
Right.
things of that sort. So King is seeing this, not because he's trying to be unpatriotic, but he's concerned for all peoples, for white and for black
Absolutely.
and for Vietnamese and beyond. And this is part of what some have called his radical empathy or his revolutionary empathy, because how can he care so much? I think it even comes into that Times article, Time Magazine article. How can he have such care for people thousands of miles away when he and his people are facing such struggle here? And some of his own people are saying, why are we putting the focus here? We're losing sight of it. It was all connected for him. It was part of that
Absolutely.
axis of evil, of racism, militarism, and economic exploitation. And so we have to account for that in our day. When we think about what you had said earlier, Tony, about needing to earn the trust of your youth. And I said, for King, I think he lived a very credible life in so many ways. It's certainly not perfect, and there are accusations and all kinds of things about his life, but let's not lose sight of the great things he did accomplish and the way he modeled love of enemy. That John R.W. Stott, another one of my heroes, said he modeled more than anyone the Sermon on the Mount's teaching on turn the cheek, love your enemy, that King modeled in the 20th century. That is a great, what I'm going to call a great public theologian and public ethicist. But with King, just that idea of, the credibility of earning the right, so much of our wars are fought by proxy. People say the wars are declining. We have all kinds of wars going on.
Right.
Russia and America might not be going to war right now, but we do our conflicts through proxy. We talk about Iranian proxy, but we have different secondary sources through which we wage these conflicts. Call it proxy or call it whatever you want to call it.
Right.
And drone warfare. Often the killings that are done, and we could get into that on another time because it's a whole conversation in itself. It's often nameless, faceless drones, operators that are elsewhere, thousands of miles away. It's almost like a video game where press the button, someone's taken out. Eye in the Sky is a great movie, by the way, that takes place in, I think, Parliament or in the UK around a table, thinking through the ethics, the legalities, the politics. Fascinating movie, worth seeing. These are complex issues. Because you don't want ground troops going in for our people, for their people, but drones, the escalation of dependence on drones, nameless, faceless drones. How do we earn a right with people? Do we not create more enemies through those eyes in the sky? And we don't get to know our enemy. We don't learn their questions, their heart cry, as King talked about in the Vietnam War address. And I think that's an issue where we have to account for it today, because these issues can be so big to us. It's like, well, I can't control the fate of nations, and I can't. But what do I do in terms of my own conflicts? Do we try and, wherever possible, because it's not always possible, wherever possible, do we try and see people eye to eye, face to face, instead of the Twitter bombs and the Facebook bombs and social media bombs? It's so hard to have real conversations, eye to eye, moving beyond the nameless and the faceless.
Absolutely.
And Jesus was named. Jesus had a face. Jesus had an identity, and he learned the views of others. He was dialogical. He lives amongst us, and he creates space with his life for his views to be heard and their views to be heard. And I think that's what you're in part getting in. And I think militarism is flying in the face of all that, because it's stockpiling these means to go after, and it may be very luxuriously speaking, but at what cost to our humanity? What cost to the beloved community?
And to your point with drone warfare and the way that combat has changed, I often wonder for us, when it comes to points of disagreement and contention, the concern is how much are our disagreements being fought via proxy. And I mean,
All
even
of our, not just the nations, right? But us.
Even interpersonal conflicts. And the way it ties into militarism is often the issue gets obfuscated and pushed into terms of the military, where the issue is no longer the issue, and what we really need to be talking about isn't what we're talking about, and we'll move towards points of debate and contention, such as militarism.
Yeah, and it's not just these generals, it's not just these politicians. They're often extensions of us.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, and we do it whether we're pacifists or, activists when it comes
Right.
to war, the hawks and the doves. We have different ways in which I've seen many doves that are actually quite hostile in their rhetoric in other ways that it's like, man, that's violent with their particular pastors. Not so with King, but it's like, how often do we really move beyond that proxy to engage the other and to listen and learn wherever possible? Sometimes it's not possible. I understand that.
Because I think when it comes to militarism, it points to a noticeable generational divide. In the time of King, when we look at how young people opposed the war, and people of an older generation also opposed the war, but something you had said was in our conversation prior to recording this was it's old people who start the conflict, and it's young people who oftentimes have to go and engage in the conflict. And I wonder for us,
I think McNamara, Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, I believe it was, just his own grief about what had been involved in that, just the haunting sense for him, whether it's Democrat or Republican or Democrat, but how often it's the older generation who creates the conflicts and the younger that have to fight them. And we all struggle with our depravity, right? I mean, that younger generation becomes older,
right,
and we all have that same struggle, but how often are we fighting battles that we didn't start?
Right, and that goes to the point of proxy, where we're never engaging the issue, whether it's we're engaging an issue that's beside the main issue, or somebody else has to always engage the issue on our behalf. But then I think that leads directly to the incarnation. Mm-hmm. I think recently I was listening to Dr. Reverend Otis Moss III, and he talks about Christ as liberator. And Christ as liberator, Christ doesn't come in top down to liberate. Mm-hmm. He doesn't defeat an enemy force, but Christ comes bottom up. He becomes one of the people to liberate the people.
Yeah.
Christ doesn't do away with sin by proxy. He incarnates and is present. It's never by proxy. Christ's life, his ministry, his redemptive movement is never by proxy.
Yeah. Yeah, it's beautiful. And, you think of Dr. John Perkins, too. Dr. John M. Perkins in his work of, community development, of relocation, reconciliation, redistribution. It's never top down, but bottom up, living amongst the people and with the people, not to the people, but with the people, bringing about transformation. It's very similar to what you're saying about Reverend Dr. Moss.
Right.
And Dr. King as well, though his work was often more in terms of oration.
Right.
As a public spokesperson, that's also what he sought to model. And if you watch that movie, the HBO movie documentary, King of the Wilderness, one of the most powerful clips in that whole film is when he's in Chicago in the, I think, mid to late 60s, living in a tenement structure with his wife, and it's cold in the winter and just in the very impoverished community. But you saw the joy in his face as he was with kids. Just the joy in his face. It was like he was delighted in the midst of great travail with the loss of his regard, more enemies, less friends, less supporters, but the joy he had with these children, with the people, not to or over the top, down toward the people. And so we have a lot to learn, don't we? And thank you for that good reflection on from the bottom up, not top down.
Because I think that contradicts the message of militarism. It's not about stockpiling to protect our stockpiles.
Yeah.
But it's about giving away so that all may have. It's not about us and them.
Right. And again, some will say, well, this is just all naive. This is all naive. And I wonder if they would say, well, Jesus was naive too. And again, one has to tread wisely on these things. Be shrewd as a serpent, innocent as a dove. We're not just to be beaten up and bullied, but I think we also have to take risks wherever possible. Jesus did take risks. We talked about this previously. It's not like tolerance where it means indifference, where for God so tolerated the world that he chose not to enter the world. No, he gave himself. Some say, well, God doesn't risk. Well, I don't know what you want to call it, but God, in sharing his life though he knew all things, he had never experienced history from the inside. And that's got to be risky, to feel that pain as a human, to live in that struggle and to share life with us, and to operate in such a way as that he loved his enemies, prayed for those who persecuted us, and told us to follow his example, and not like the pagans who just love one another, who are their friends, but to love the other who's not their friend, the enemy, because that's how God operates. That blows my mind. I mean, I know that. I can quote the Sermon on the Mount, parts of it at least, and I just go, I still don't get that. It's so radical. We need the Holy Spirit. We need one another. We need the church. We need others, even outside the church, who are living into the beloved community ideals to help us move in that direction.
And I mean, on the point of risk, it leads us to our third point of partisan pietism.
Right. So if we could come to that now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so, we talked a little bit before about nationalism, and I said, there's a contrast to be made between patriotism and nationalism. I certainly think everyone should consider their country great. They should love their family. They should love their community at large. Doesn't mean they have to like everything about it, but as Dr. Perkins said to us once at a New Wine Conference, we need to love our city. And I said Jeremiah of old loved his city. He loved his city. He challenged them big time. He was the weeping prophet, weeping over their sins and calling them to repentance. But he also went into exile with them. He loved his people. And, the idea that we have to say our nation is best or my family's best, well, why can't I just say I really love my dad? Why can't I say I really love my mom? I love my wife. Do I have to say that this is the best human being out there? They might tell me I have to say it, but why can't I just say I cherish them? Same thing with a nation. Does ours have to be the best at every turn? Some will say yes. That's what it means to be patriotic. And it moves toward a kind of nationalism that our country can do no wrong. Absolutely. That our community can do no wrong. That's what I mean by nationalism. I want to be a patriot, but I do not want to be a nationalist. I want to be loyal, but ultimately I have to ask, not is God on my side, but am I on God's side? And some people even say, if I could just quickly make a point so I don't lose it and come back, I hear a lot of people saying God is on the side of the oppressed. Some friends of mine who work in the area of liberation theology and worked on a book with them in the area of liberation theology said, God is against oppression. And they are liberation theologians, but they said, it's not quite apt to say God is on the side of the oppressed, because sometimes once the oppressed get the power, then they go and oppress.
Absolutely.
So God is for the oppressed, God is against oppression, but sometimes the hubris can show up even for the oppressed, where they take matters into their own hands. And I appreciated that qualification, not because it means, don't care for the oppressed. No, God is for the oppressed.
Absolutely.
But God is for God. But when God is for God, God is for the orphan, the widow, and the alien and the distressed, because God became weak. God became poor. God became homeless. God became the undocumented, so to speak. You see this in Matthew 25, when I was an alien, when I was a stranger. Say, undocumented. Well, they didn't have borders quite like we have borders today. I mean, so let's not impose on the biblical text. And I need to be careful not to impose on the biblical text, but as Elie Wiesel said, there is no such thing as an illegal human being. We've got to make sure we don't miss that point. The great Nobel Prize winner and Holocaust survivor knew quite a bit about that subject, of how people can say, just because of borders, you're illegal, don't come, and not to care for them, not to hear their heart cry. So that being the case, back to nationalism in contradistinction to patriotism, patriotism doesn't say everything my family or my country, in this particular case, is right. I'll never apologize. Well, then what do you do with Nehemiah 9, Ezra 9, Daniel 9, God forgive us? Prophets identifying with the people, even righteous Daniel, righteous Ezra, righteous Nehemiah, God forgive us. So we do sin. That's a biblical value. And so when I look at Abraham Lincoln, he was patriotic. I mean, absolutely patriotic. But I don't see him as a nationalist. And I didn't see him as ultimately taking sides in his second inaugural. Even though he said, we're going to win this war to bring the South back with the North into the Union, he said, let's not point the finger. It's just days before he's killed. Let's not point the finger at the South, because we're all responsible for bringing this war on. And he is a great public theologian like King, in his own way. Lincoln was a great public theologian. He didn't have a lot of hubris. He saw that God's ways were beyond our ways. He didn't think, God's on my side. He didn't think, I know everything that the Almighty thinks. No, God is beyond our thinking. Also, we are all implicated in this, because Wall Street was built on the backs of slaves.
Absolutely.
Cotton industry and the like. I mean, it was big business in the North. In the North, it was quite late when they got rid of slavery. So the whole economic base of America, historically, and our wealth today even, great nation that it is. I'm a patriot, but that doesn't mean I have to say everything about it's great. And I need to be loyal, but loyal doesn't mean I can't challenge, and I need to be challenged.
Absolutely.
You challenge me at times, but you're loyal to me because you care. The question is, why do we challenge? Is it because we have a dream that's a beloved community dream, like you were saying? Well, then it's a good challenge. If we just want to take shots to tear down, well, that's not patriotic. That's not biblical. We challenge, and we are challenged so that we might grow. Nationalism does not allow for that. Nativism, my people are better than your people, my people are the best, whether it's genetically or socially, culturally, religiously. Nativism, nationalism, I think is deeply disturbing from a biblical vantage point, especially when you take into account whose side are you on. I'm not on your side, I'm not on the Canaanite side. As the Captain Lord's army, I have come, take off those sandals, this is holy ground. Question is, whose side are we on, God's or our own? And so nativism, nationalism, my people are the best, we do no wrong, and putting down others, othering them, that's very problematic. And that's what I mean by this kind of patriotic, not patriotic, I called it what? I called it partisan pietism. God's on our side, God's on our side. That's the pietism, the piety, the faith. I believe in God, but is it simply the God of the nation? Or is the nation supposed to be under God? We talk about one nation under God. Sometimes I wonder if we're one nation over God.
And it's God of the nation or God of the nations.
Exactly. Exactly.
And
I'm all for the flag in a church as long as we have other flags, because the church belongs not simply to a nation, it belongs to the kingdom of God. And we need in American evangelical Christianity to get back to an understanding that it's the gospel of the kingdom, not the gospel of individualism. It's the gospel of the kingdom, not the gospel of partisan politics. And I'm talking about left and right and anywhere in between. I'm not taking sides with it's far bigger than that, far more profound than the kind of, Jesus is a Democrat or Jesus is a Republican or Jesus is a libertarian or an independent. Really? He's none of those things. He's beyond those things. He intersects those things. He is always moving to say, take off those sandals. This is holy ground. And Captain Lord's army, many early theologians thought that was a pre-incarnate form of Christ, a theophany, namely related to Jesus.
And when we talk about partisan pietism and nationalism, it's always in the movement of those topics and subjects to be first, to be best. But then when we look at our Lord's words, the first shall be last, and the last shall be first.
Yeah.
And recently...
And pride goes before a fall.
Absolutely. And recently Reverend Dr. Charles Date said, if the white American church had stood up in the history of our nation, we would not have slavery. But for the sake of economic advantage, for the sake of partisan pietism, nationalism, militarism, whatever form militarism has taken through the course of the history of our nation, if the white church hadn't moved to a side of the aisle, slavery would not be in existence. And that critique, I think, is so profound, because it's always, how do we be best? How do we be first? And it goes so countercultural and counterstream to our inclinations, because who wants to be last economically? who wants to be last militarily? I mean, practically or pragmatically speaking, it's dangerous to be last in those categories. But we have to take our Lord's words.
Absolutely. And if you even think about some of the early Puritan figures in America, because, we talk about American relationship to God, its history, and we're not going to get into historiography today, but, Jonathan Edwards and his disciple Hopkins, dealt with benevolence. And, Hopkins talks about disinterested benevolence and was a radical abolitionist, unlike his mentor, Jonathan Edwards, who's a great public theologian in his own right. But maybe at some point we could deal with that disinterested benevolence theme and what that meant for Hopkins in terms of the fight against slavery, for abolition. And it was the abolitionists who pushed King, and it was abolitionists who pushed Lincoln, not King. He was one of those, in the emancipation and moving beyond that towards civil rights and equality, equity. But certainly abolitionists, many of whom were evangelicals, and also in England, when you look at Wilberforce, abolitionists pushed Parliament. Longing for that today, as John Perkins said, we weren't there in the civil rights movement with King. And where were these figures at the time of slavery? Well, they were arising, Hopkins being one, Jonathan Edwards Jr. being one. But I believe it was someone like Jonathan Edwards Sr., the great Puritan theologian, who talked about, and others with him, that if really America is this chosen people, well, judgment always starts in the house of God. And I think we always have to guard against hubris or arrogance. Whenever someone sees themselves as a chosen people, it can be dangerous, especially if we impose that on other countries with our manifestos and colonialism with the West and such, and post-colonialism and the like. But the idea of, if we really are a chosen people, judgment always starts first in the household of God. And I think we have to keep that in mind. So as we think through this matter of, Dr. King's legacy and just our own limited reflections on this at New Wine Tastings, we've dealt with the theme of patriotism, militarism, and this idea of partisan pietism. May always keep in mind that, it's not whose side is God on, but what side are we on? And knowing that judgment always starts in the household of God. So we need to be careful in our claims and make sure that we stand under Christ, not over him. And that's a challenge for all of us.
Absolutely.
Tony, thanks so much. And I'm Paul Lewis Metzger, Tony Wynn. Thank you for joining us for New Wine Tastings.